today's teaching with a quote. It's my daughter. She's allowed to interrupt.
She's heckling.
Yeah, I know. She's heckling. Can you believe that? So I want to open today's teaching with a quote, not from the Bible, but from Richard Dawkins. I don't know if you guys know who Richard Dawkins is. He's one of the leading atheists in the world today. He's written numerous books on evolution, and actually a book on atheism called The God Delusion. In 2009 was a big year because that was the 200th anniversary of Charles Darwin's birth. Okay? And it was also the 150th anniversary of Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. Okay? So in 2009, a bunch of evolutionists came out with their own books, giving evidence for evolution. And so he came out with a book called The Greatest Show on Earth. And this is what he says in the opening pages. He says, "Evolution is a fact, beyond reasonable doubt, beyond serious doubt, beyond sane, informed, intelligent doubt. Beyond doubt, evolution is a fact." He says, the evidence for evolution is at least as strong as the evidence for the Holocaust. These are strong, confident words from Richard Dawkins. Jerry Coyne also came out with a book, also a famous atheist, in 2009. The book was called Why Evolution is True. He said, "Evolution is a fact. And far from casting doubt on Darwinism, the evidence gathered by scientists over the past century and a half supports it completely." Okay? And so, pretty confident words. Now, Richard Dawkins even goes further. In a book review in the New York Times, he's even more blunt. He says, "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane. Or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that." Now, I'm not going to poll you on who believes in evolution or not, because after those words, you feel kind of... And so, what do? You know, some Christians today are feeling the weight of these kind of claims and the pressure to conform with the scientific majority. And so, sadly, they're doing whatever it takes to capitulate with evolution. In fact, there's a whole host of books that are coming out that are trying to show there's no conflict with evolution and Christianity. Some of these books include Francis Collins' The Language of God, 2006 that came out. He was the head of the Human Genome Project. They mapped the entire human genome. So this is a smart guy. You have Carl Giberson, Saving Darwin. Kenneth Miller, he's a Roman Catholic. He says he's got a book called Finding Darwin's God. So these are high up in the food chain as far as theistic evolution goes. And these are bright guys. And so we're going to look at this question: is evolution compatible with Christianity? Well, another big name in this debate is Albert Mohler. He's actually the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And commenting on a group called BioLogos, they are a group that actually exists to actually bring together evolution and Christianity. And he says this about that group. He says, "The BioLogos approach to the issue is now clear. They want to discredit the evangelical objections to evolution and to convince the evangelical public that an acceptance of evolution is the means of furthering the gospel." So they're existing. I mean, they're right-hearted but wrong-headed, I think. They want to make the gospel look more appealing, so let's accept evolution. That's what he's saying. He goes on. "They have leveled their guns against the intelligent design movement, at young earth creationism, and against virtually all resistance to the embrace of evolution. They claim that an embrace of evolution is necessary if evangelicalism is not to be intellectually marginalized by the larger culture." He goes on. They have warned that the refusal to embrace evolution will doom evangelicalism to the status of an intellectual cult. Okay, pretty powerful words. Now, we're going to look at this question: are evolution and Christianity compatible? Or should Christians embrace evolution? Well, you don't have to be in the evangelical world very long to see that this is one of the biggest questions. It's at the forefront of most conversations. In fact, this month in Christianity, if you get Christianity Today, July and August, the cover story is a tale of two scientists. One is a theistic evolutionist, one's a young earth creationist. Okay? In the past year, they had an issue that came out asking the question, is Adam historical? Because there's a huge movement, which we'll look at, a huge push to say Adam wasn't a historical figure. He was actually evolved from an ape-like ancestor and is like a mythical creature in the Bible. And there's also some of the World Magazine said that these were their books of the year in 2011. One's God and Evolution. This is answering the objections. And should Christians embrace evolution? I'd recommend both those books, by the way. So as it turns out, that before we can answer this question, we have to answer the question, what do we mean by evolution? Okay? What do we mean by evolution? Because evolution has a number of different meanings. Okay? It's equivocal. So here are some of the meanings. It could mean change over time. I could say my car has evolved. You know, it's actually going downhill. We could say the Corvette has evolved over time. You could put all the different Corvettes from the 50s, 60s, 70s and say there's an evolution of the Corvette. So just change over time. Change in gene frequency and population. My wife and I got married. We have a daughter now. And some of my genes are in her. Some of my wife's genes are in her. So there's been a change in the gene population. So that's all that means. There's limited common descent. What that means is, you know, all humans have a common ancestor. 2 humans. Every creationist believes that. All dogs have a common ancestor. 2 dogs, okay? So limited common ancestry. Also, it can refer to the mechanism, natural selection acting on random mutations. These are uncontroversial definitions. The most avid young earth creationist agrees with all of these definitions of evolution. So evolution in this sense is perfectly compatible with the Bible and Christianity. Here's the controversial definition. Also, we call these microevolution. Okay? Maybe you've heard that term, microevolution. The controversial terms are universal common descent. Now, that means that all of life has a single common ancestor. So think of the tree of life, okay? And we all evolved from a single-celled organism. That's what that means. That's more controversial. And number 6, sometimes called the blind watchmaker thesis. All organisms have descended from a common ancestor, and this is the important part, solely through an unguided, unintelligent, purposeless material process. Okay? Those words are very crucial. Okay? And so, and this is called, by the way, macroevolution. Okay? So I'm going to argue that I think microevolution is true and testable, and you can observe it, and I'm going to try and demonstrate that macroevolution isn't. So what about this definition number 6? I want to look at this a little more closely because I think there's a logical problem with trying to hold to this definition of evolution and believe in God. Let me demonstrate. The question is, can God use, and I put Neo-Darwinian, that's the unguided, unintelligent, purposeless process. Can God use a Neo-Darwinian process or evolution? And I would submit to you that that's like saying, can God guide an unguided process? Or can God direct an undirected process? These are logically contradictory terms, okay? And God, this may not sound right, but God can't even do the logically impossible, okay? God can't make a square circle because a square, by definition, has 4 sides and 90-degree angles, and a circle doesn't, okay? So God can't guide an unguided process, nor would we want him to, because we think it's a guided process. So this is logically incoherent, okay? And I would say that if evolution is guided, then Neo-Darwinian evolution is false. If evolution is unguided, then God had no part in guiding it. Okay, it's as simple as that. It's one or the other. It's an either-or kind of thing. Now some people, I was actually with someone not too long ago, and this is called the law of non-contradiction. Basically it says, A and not A can't be true at the same time in the same sense. So I can't be in this church, standing here, and not in the church, standing here, at the same time in the same sense. Okay? It's just rudimentary logic. And this person said, so someone denied the law of non-contradiction to me. It's a postmodern thing to do. And this is what a Muslim philosopher says. Avicenna said this in the 11th century. He said, anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be beaten is not the same as not to be beaten, and to be burned is not the same as not to be burned. You get the picture? I think it's pretty genius. Don't actually do that, but you get the point, right? You know what? Kenneth Miller, I showed you his book before, Finding Darwin's God. He actually sees the contradiction. And as a result, he comes to the following conclusion. He says, mankind's appearance on this planet is not preordained. that we are here as an afterthought, a minor detail, a happenstance in a history that might just as well have left us out. He says this, and in a 2007 conference, Miller admitted that evolution is so undirected that it could have produced big-brain dinosaurs or a mollusk, like a snail or a squid, with exceptional mental capabilities rather than human beings. And that's true. I mean, if evolution is unguided, then it could have done that. And so human beings, aren't so special after all. So he sees the contradiction, but he changes his theology, not his theory of evolution. Okay? And we see that happening quite a bit. Richard Dawkins also gets the logical implications of all this. In his book, The Blind Watchmaker, we call it the Blind Watchmaker thesis. It comes from his book, very famous book. He says, although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. See, he got it. He got it. An undirected natural process doesn't need God, nor is it even compatible with God as a creator in any meaningful way. Now, this is the book I would highly recommend. Should Christians Embrace Evolution? In the foreword, Wayne Grudem, he's a systematic theologian, professor of theology and biblical studies, he beautifully put this. He says, to put it in terms of an equation, when atheists assure us that matter plus evolution plus zero, nothing, equals all living things, and then theistic evolutionists answer, no, it's matter plus evolution plus God that equals all living things, it will not take long for unbelievers to conclude, therefore, God equals nothing. Okay? He's not necessary. He's superfluous or unnecessary. So, before even looking at the scientific evidence for evolution or the theological implications, which we will do, from a logical perspective, we can discount the theistic evolution view altogether. Okay? But now let's look at the scientific problems. And again, we're looking at the scientific problems with macroevolution. It turns out, if it turns out that there are serious scientific problems with the theory, then there's no need for a Christian or anyone else to try and marry evolution with Christianity. Okay? So the two pillars of macroevolution, universal common descent, and this idea of undirected, unguided evolution. Okay? So that first pillar, universal common descent, is depicted as a tree. It's called the evolutionary tree of life. Now, this is the idea of goo to you via the zoo. Have you heard people say stuff like that? Or molecules to man evolution. Okay, we all evolved from a single common ancestor. Now, this is vertical change. Okay, you're going from this creature to this creature to this creature until you get to human beings. Now, creation, by contrast, looks more like an orchard of life. So you got the tree of life, we'll call it the orchard of life. Now, there's variations within the created kinds, but you don't have one created kind changing into another created kind. Okay? Another kind of animal. In fact, 10 times in Genesis 1, chapter 1, you see God saying, and they'll reproduce after their kind. So dogs into other dogs, humans into other humans. Okay? Not dog into something else. And this would be horizontal change. Okay? So you got your orchard of life, your tree of life. Now, at this point, I've got to give you a word of caution, because we're going to survey some of the arguments. Actually, I put a huge presentation together. My wife hates when I do this. And then I figured out how long it would be, 40 minutes, I've got to cut it off. So I have all these slides that I can't show you, I wish I could. But just kind of to summarize a lot of the different arguments, they kind of go like this. Of course I believe evolution is true, and they're speaking about this kind of evolution, those two pillars we just looked at, macroevolution, because I see evolution happen all the time. And they'll give an example of microevolution. Okay? That's called the bait and switch. Of course evolution is true. Look, it happens all the time. Okay? So there's this idea of macro and micro, and they're being confused. Don't let people do that. Okay? Don't be fooled by this. They could give you all the examples of microevolution in the world, and that doesn't add up to a single evidence of macroevolution. They're not the same thing. Let me show you. In a textbook, I know you guys have been out of the science classroom, or some of you have for a little while, so let me give you just kind of a quick example or illustration of natural selection. So let's imagine we have two dogs. We have these dogs have medium length fur. That's because they have a gene, one gene that spells out long fur, the other gene short fur. And we'll say they have a combination effect, okay? So long, short, they make medium length fur. Now, if I take one gene short fur from dad and one short gene from mom, I'm going to get two short gene in this dog, and so in the offspring. So he's going to have short hair. And I can do the same thing and show, hey, he's going to have medium length fur, he's going to have medium length fur as well. And this guy at the end, he's got a bad hair day. He's got a long-haired gene from mom and a long-haired gene from dad, so he has long fur. Now, here's natural selection in action. Let's take these dogs and let's put them, I was going to say in the Arctic, but let's just say it's a really cold winter. These are wild dogs. If it's a really cold winter, guess what happens? It's really sad. These two guys, they die, okay? Because they can't survive. They don't have the fur to keep them warm, and so they get hypothermia or something and they die. Like this guy, if he can find a mate that actually likes his hairdo, then guess what's going to happen? They're going to get married. No, they're not actually get married. But they're going to reproduce. But notice that they're only going to be able to produce dogs with long hair. Okay? And this is natural selection in action. And this, we can observe this. In fact, it's called artificial selection when we actually do it. All those dogs you see out there today, most of those are the result of us artificially selecting for genes. Because, we really like that nose that's smushed up against the dog's face. Okay? And you'll change the dog if you throw in a dog that has a long snout or a long nose. So, but notice what happened. We lost genetic information. And this whole debate kind of centers around genetic information, okay? If you want to go from paramecium to people, as I'll show you, you need to increase genetic information. So a textbook example of this is the finch beak. This is in every evolutionary biology textbook that you will see. High school textbooks show the finch beak and they say, here's proof of evolution. But notice, this is, Darwin, he was on his voyage on the HMS Beagle, and he went to the Galapagos Islands. He saw 13 different species of finch, and he noticed the shape and the size of the beaks were different, and he thought, you know what? This is a result of different food supply and the different habitats. But that's just an example of microevolution, okay? Just an example of microevolution, nothing to get excited about. It turns out natural selection selects, it doesn't create anything, okay? So if you want to create something new, you have to change the genome. You got to change the DNA. And the way you change your DNA is through mutations. Now, the problem is, and so I was on the University of Berkeley website this week. They have a website, University of Berkeley, called Understanding Evolution. I read every page to see if there was anything, I was missing. And they said this: mutations are essential to evolution. They are the raw material of genetic variation. Without mutation, evolution could not occur, and that's true. Natural selection on its own only selects, mutations create. The problem is mutations are almost always harmful. Okay? We spoke of John, was it John, who has cancer? Mm-hmm. Cancer is a result of a mutation. Okay? The cells mutate, and it's not a good thing. So most mutations are are mutagenic, or they change the cells, and they're not good. Carcinogenic is the word I was looking for. And so, but sometimes a mutation will help you survive, although it doesn't add information to your genome. Here's an example. Also, a textbook icon of evolution is antibiotic resistance. Okay? And so this guy right here, that is Helicobacter pylori. I'm going to call him H. pylori. He causes stomach ulcers. You don't want him. And so if you, I won't show the picture of the stomach ulcer, but if you get H. pylori, you've got to take antibiotics. And if you take antibiotics, hopefully it kills the bacteria. But here's the thing. Some of the bacteria evolve, and now the antibiotic doesn't work. Is this proof for evolution? Well, let's see. Depends what you mean by evolution. Because here's H. pylori. What happens is, he's a cell, and he absorbs the antibiotic through his cell wall. And he has an enzyme inside him, an enzyme, that actually converts the antibiotic to a poison. And that's how he dies. It's called assisted suicide. You use something in the bacteria to help kill it. And so, the poison kills the bacteria. Now, what if we have a mutant H. pylori, and this mutant doesn't produce the enzyme? Then you can give him antibiotics all day long. And that particular antibiotic that mixes with the enzyme is not going to produce a poison. And so, no enzyme, no poison, no death. He goes on to reproduce. And but notice what happened here. Is this going to get you from single-cell bacteria to a human being? He lost information. In fact, when you take this mutant H. pylori, put him in a petri dish next to the normal H. pylori, and take away the antibiotic and just have them duke it out to see who survives, survival of the fittest, guess who wins? The normal bacteria wins. Okay? And so this is not an example that's evidence for macroevolution. It's just microevolution. And so, like I said before, the problem is you got to get from a paramecium to people. And more specifically, the problem is a paramecium has a ton of information in it. But the information in a paramecium is not as much information as in a person. In fact, the person has information in the DNA to make eyeballs, and to make ears, and lungs, and heart, and all these different features, a brain, okay? All of that's in the DNA. We'll look at the DNA more in a second. But just as a broad observation, you got to get more information. Well, how do you do it? Well, not through the mechanism they've shown. Mutations in natural selection are not capable. There are limits. And that's the problem with a lot of this evolutionary theory. They extrapolate too far. It just won't work. Let's look at some fossil evidence. Well, there's something called the Cambrian explosion, sometimes called biology's Big Bang. What it is it describes a geologically sudden appearance of multicellular animals in the fossil record during the Cambrian period. Now, I'm going to just assume for the sake of the argument that the geological record is a record of millions of years, just for the sake of the argument. Now, what we see in the fossil record then is a whole bunch of animals showing up at 530 million years ago in the Cambrian rock layers. And they're there, they all show up in about a span, the geologists say, of 5 to 10 million years. Okay? Here's the thing, before the Cambrian rock layer, we have the pre-Cambrian rock layer. So we would expect to see all these intermediates, all this proof of evolution. The problem is that rock layer has no intermediates in it. Okay? None. This is a huge problem for evolutionists. In fact, Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, says it's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. This is a huge problem, sometimes called Darwin's dilemma. Now, what other evidence is there from the fossil record? Well, it turns out there's something called stasis. Stasis is when organisms remain largely unchanged throughout their duration in the fossil record. Let me give you a couple examples. The coelacanth. This is the fish. Now, this particular fish, we find in the fossil record, again assuming their dating method, 400 million years ago. The crazy thing, it looks identical to the coelacanth that swims around today. In 400 million years, it hasn't changed even the slightest. Here's another point. The coelacanth, we thought, went extinct 70 million years ago, because in the fossil record, it shows up from 400 to 70 million years, and then from 70 to the present, you don't find them. They thought it went extinct with the dinosaurs. Turns out, this guy was, in 1938, they found this guy swimming around. Turns out there's lots of them, okay? And so, just an interesting observation. The horseshoe crab. I just grabbed the ones that were really long periods of time. 450 million years ago. Hasn't changed in the slightest. A lamprey. These are ugly-looking creatures, but 330 million years hasn't changed. This thing should be evolving and everything else, but no, it's just an interesting observation. Missing links. Actually, it was Darwin in his book in 1859, The Origin of Species. He said that missing links was the greatest, or the most obvious and greatest objection which can be urged against my theory. Okay? There was missing links at his time. 150 years ago. Well, what's the problem like today? Have they found those fossils? Well, in 1979, David Rupp, he wrote, well, we are now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has greatly expanded. Then he says, ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. So some of those transitions which we thought were transitions turned out not to be. I mean, I could do a whole talk on human evolution. They found a pig's tooth. Well, they thought it was an evolutionary ancestor of human beings, and so they built this ape-like man, and then later on they found it was actually an extinct pig's tooth. So, I mean, they start losing some of those transitional forms. Stephen Jay Gould, very famous evolutionist, he saw the problem with this slow and gradual process because it wasn't in the fossil record. He says, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of the branches, just at the ends there. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Okay? So he came up with his own theory with another guy called punctuated equilibrium, okay? Where evolution works more in these jumps because there was no slow and gradual evolution in the fossil record. Okay, so we've looked at some problems with evolution. I don't think the evidence adds up. Now I want to show that there's actually evidence for design in nature. In fact, I don't have to convince Richard Dawkins or any other evolutionist that there's design in nature. They actually see the design, but they call it apparent design. So you have Professor Richard Lewontin. He's from Harvard University. He says, he admits that living things appear to have been carefully and artfully designed. Okay? Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, I feel like I'm quoting that a lot, but page 1, he says, biology is the study of complex things that appear to have been designed for a purpose. They appear to have been designed for a purpose. So, what's this appearance we're speaking about? And is there a way to distinguish between appearance, apparent design, and real design? How do we know when it's just apparent and when the apparent design is real design? Here's an illustration. So, I have 4 rock formations on here. If you drive in the Black Hills of South Dakota, you'll come across a particular rock formation. It's called Mount Rushmore, okay? And no one would think that that happened just wind and erosion over time. You know that that happened from intelligent design because those faces actually match 4 US presidents, okay? And so it's actually called specified complexity. I'm going to come back to that word in a second. There's also, down here, the Grand Canyon. You can see that that's obviously just wind and erosion and water over either a long period of time, or if you believe in young Earth, then you would say that happened over a short period of time with a lot of water at the end of the flood. And so either way, it happened naturally. Okay? Now in between, we have a couple other rock formations that might be a little harder to distinguish. This one here, this is in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. This is called the Old Man of the Mountain. Okay? And it resembles, I don't know if you can see that, does that resemble kind of the side profile of an old man's face? Now you have to be at just the right angle, and you got to be at just the right distance to see the face. But this actually is not design. It's apparent design. It's actually just, again, wind, erosion, rain, that kind of thing that formed this. Another thing that actually appears maybe undesigned, this one probably isn't a great example because you can see it kind of looks like an arrowhead. But for someone just walking in a cave, they may see that and it looks like a stone. But an archaeologist who's trained would see, no, that's an arrowhead. That's been carved that way. Okay, so there's these different things. There's appearance of design, and there's real design. There's appearance of design, and it's really not design. There's appearance that's undesigned, but really designed. And then the last one is appears undesigned, and it really isn't designed. And so there's 4 categories. Now what we're going to look at is these 2 that have to do with appearance of design. How do we tell the difference between these 2? Because Richard Dawkins says biology is like this. But we want to say, no, it's actually like this. Is there a way to do that? Well, before I show you that, one common response comes from Francis Crick. And he takes a more naturalistic response. He says, there's no designer, so there can't be any real design. I'm not even going to look at the option of real design, okay? He says, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see is not design, but rather evolved. Just keep telling yourself that, okay? Because there is no design. Now, design theorists have a better way. They follow the evidence where it leads. Might be a good thing to do. This means that there's the possibility that apparent design is real design. Okay? It appears designed because it actually is designed. And so there's two things we're going to look at: irreducible complexity and specified complexity. It was actually Charles Darwin who said, if it could be demonstrated that a complex organ exists which could not possibly have formed from numerous successive slight modifications, then my theory would absolutely break down. Well, Michael Behe, he's a professor at Lehigh University, he believes he's done just that. Behe believes he's identified different biological systems and structures, which he calls, and he coined the term, irreducibly complex. Okay? And he says that irreducible complexity or an irreducibly complex system is one composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the whole system to effectively cease functioning. If you didn't follow that, here's an example he cites in his book. He cites a mousetrap. A mousetrap has 5 parts. If you take any one of those parts, the platform, the spring, the catch, the hammer, the holding bar, if you take any one of those away, you can't catch a mouse with it, okay? It doesn't function as it was intended to. This is an irreducibly complex structure. And so he says that points to intelligent design. So in biology, there's actually irreducibly complex structures. One of those is called the bacterium flagellum, okay? Now some bacteria have something called a flagellum. It's a tail, okay? Some bacteria have these little tails, and they help them move around in their environment, okay? The tail is like a mini outboard motor, but it's way, way more complicated than an outboard motor. The flagellum actually spins. Let me give you a close-up view of it. That's with an electron microscope. This is just an animation. The flagellum, or the tail, spins at 100,000 RPM. 100,000 revolutions per minute. That's 1,600 revolutions in 1 second. And it can stop in a quarter of a turn and go back the other way. Okay? So this guy has this really efficient motor. Now the motor is made up of 40 different protein parts. So just like this guy, this Honda engine is made up of different parts, this motor is made up of different parts. And all those parts have to exist, and they actually have to be in the right order and form at the right rate for it all to function properly. And if any one of those things is off, then your flagellum, your tail, doesn't work. Okay? So this is irreducible complexity. And this points strongly to evidence at the molecular, the minuscule level. You have these different machines, okay? And this points us to design, not to evolution. The other thing is specified complexity. Now, specified complexity is, let me give you an analogy to show you. Because you guys all actually know what specified complexity is. You just probably haven't heard the term. So here's my example. Suppose I'm 29 right now. Suppose on my 30th birthday, my wife buys me a car. She's not going to do that. But let's say she buys me a car. And my license plate says BDY 9543. Okay? Now, this license plate is highly improbable for me to get. Highly improbable for me to get. But there's nothing designed about it. It's just, it looks like I just got a chance license plate slapped to my car. Now imagine I got this license plate. It says TIM and the year I was born, 1983, on my birthday. Now, would it be proper for me to conclude that, you know, there had to be some numbers on my license plate and someone had to get this number eventually, so I'm just a lucky one with my name on it and the year I was born on my birthday? You see, this is what we call specified complexity. There's complexity. Both license plate had the probability of me getting those exact numbers about 1 in 175 million. Same improbability. But it's the independently specified pattern that actually tips me off that it's designed. Okay? So my name plus the year of my birth. Okay? In fact, I was going to use an example. My neighbor he just became a real estate agent, and so he actually had a license plate that says real estate for you, and it's a new car as well. So I was going to use that, but I thought, this was cool too. So this is a design inference, okay? Now my neighbor is an atheist, and I need to talk to him about, the design of his license plate, and maybe point him to design in biology. So where am I going with this? Well, we're gonna bring this specified complexity down to the DNA. So it's been said by Bill Gates, for one, that DNA is like a computer program far, far more advanced than any software ever created. There's our origin of life researcher who also says the problem of the origin of life is clearly basically equivalent to the problem of the origin of biological information. So what are they talking about? Well, scientists have discovered that the DNA double helix molecule has specified complexity. What do I mean? Well, just as the English language has a code system, okay, that we call the alphabet, has 26 letters, the DNA has a code system as well, a nucleotide bases that actually run along the backbone of the DNA molecule. It's a 4-letter alphabet, okay? So these are nucleotide bases. We give them the letters G, C, A, T, okay? Now, just as an English sentence, like the car was red and the car had 1 key, I put them in 3-letter words because it turns out in the DNA molecule, every 3 letters is actually, if you know anything about biology, is a codon, and that actually codes for amino acids. So I picked those 3 letters, but these actually both have information in them. And if you change a letter on either one of these, you actually mess the whole thing up, okay? Because these code for proteins, and proteins are the building blocks of life, and so without the DNA sequence right, you're not going to get proteins, you're not going to get life, okay? It's a huge problem for evolutionists. And so from our uniform and repeat experience, complex specified information like in a computer program, like in a book, or in the DNA molecule always point to an intelligent mind. Okay, so now that we have a couple reasons to think that there's actually design in nature, let's move on to the theological implications, okay? And this is probably the biggest objection, okay? So I showed the logical problem and I've showed the scientific problem, but I think the theological problem is probably the biggest for these theistic evolutionists to get over. So there's lots of different theological reasons that I could give to show evolution and Christianity are incompatible. We talk about the order of events. We could go through Genesis 1. I could just read Genesis 1 to you, and I think you'd come to the conclusion that, that evolution just isn't in there. But I want to focus on one major problem, and that concerns the existence of Adam. Theistic evolutionists hold that the evolution of humans came from an ape-like ancestor. As a result, they don't believe that Adam was a historical figure. So here's Carl Giberson in his own words. He says, the Genesis story of creation loses all contact with natural history and starts to look strangely like an old-fashioned fairy tale that might teach a lesson, but certainly makes no claims to historicity. He goes on to say, I began to wonder how an old story about a guy named man in a magical garden who had a mate named woman made from one of his ribs could ever be mistaken as actual history. Okay? So he writes the whole thing off. Now, does the Bible actually hint towards Adam being a historical person? So I think there's theological implications, but let's just see what the Bible says. Well, you could look at the genealogies in Genesis 5, and you'd see, hey, Adam was a real person. He lived to be 130. He fathered sons. Interesting. First Chronicles actually includes Adam in the list, the genealogy there. Luke 3 puts Adam in there as well in the New Testament. So it seems, just from the genealogies, that Adam's a real person. And you don't need a PhD to see that you can't be descended from a metaphor, okay? It doesn't work that way. You need to have a human parent. And so, what about other verses in the Bible? Well, Jude 1:14 actually says that Enoch was the 7th from Adam. And if you go back to the genealogies, you see, hey, Jude knew what he's talking about. There's 7 generations between Enoch and Adam. Jesus himself, actually speaking on divorce, says in Mark, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Who is he talking about? He was talking about Adam and Eve, okay? So I think that on Jesus' authority, we can see that Adam was a real person. Now, I haven't mentioned Paul yet. There's a reason for that. Because the problem is even worse. Because without a historical Adam, there's no historical fall. Think about it. Without Adam, there's no fall. Without a historical fall, there's no original sin. If there's no original sin, then there's no need for a redeemer from our original sin. There is a huge theological problem here. So listen to Paul's argument. He says, therefore, as one trespass. Now, what's he talking about, one trespass? He's talking about Adam and Eve and that one trespass. It led to the condemnation to all men. The reason we are all condemned is from that one trespass. So one act of righteousness, Jesus dying on the cross, is justification and life to all men. For as by the one man's disobedience, again, the one man's disobedience. In fact, I was reading one theistic evolutionist. He said that at the time of Adam, Adam, there was probably around 10 million human beings on the planet. So that means I might not be descended from Adam. And I see a huge theological problem with that as well. And so, by one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners. That's why I'm a sinner. So the one man's obedience, the many will be made righteous. Okay? Now, Giverson clears up. You may be thinking, well, then what's original sin? What is sin on the theistic evolutionist worldview? Well, he argues that sin was there from the very beginning. From the evolution of the first self-replicating organism. Because he says this, selfishness drives the evolutionary process. Unselfish creatures died, and their unselfish genes perished with them. Selfish creatures who attended to their own needs for food, power, and sex flourished and passed on their genes to their offspring. After many generations, selfishness was so fully programmed into our genomes that it was a significant part of what we now call human nature. So, from the whole process is sinful, okay? But what does the Bible say? It says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man. Sin wasn't there before the one man, right? Selfishness wasn't there the whole time. It was a good creation, and Adam brings in sin, and then as a result of sin, what comes? And death through sin. So death shows up, and death spread to all men because all sinned. And then you see Paul again, 1 Corinthians 15, he says, for by a man came death, by a man has come the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, everybody dies because of Adam, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. Now, what is this talking about? It's talking about two histories of death. Think about this for a second. On the biblical view, there was no death. And then man sins, and it brings death into the world. And then God's going to get rid of death eventually. But on an evolutionary worldview, you have sin and death from the very beginning. And so it's actually two opposite views of death. You have man brings death into the world. In the evolution view, evolution teaches that death brought man into the world. Right? Death actually brings man into the world. It's completely opposite view of death. What about the creation? Now, the doctrine of creation teaches that it was very good. Okay? God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Now, on the evolutionary, the theistic evolution view, there is no good creation. From the very beginning, it was always pain, suffering, and death. Okay? And that perpetuates. And in fact, it shouldn't stop, because technically we're still evolving. Okay? And so, and that raised another theological problem, because God rested at the end of creation. But on a theistic evolution worldview, the process is still going. If God's somehow using evolution, the process is still continuing. He's still creating, I guess. It just doesn't make any sense. There's so many problems. And so, the Bible teaches that the wages of sin is death, and the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. If you can't trust the first part of this verse because of science, why would you trust the second part? This is the conflict I see with holding the view. In fact, God, Paul says the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. Okay? So, on a theistic evolution view, death is part of the very good creation. So I'm just going to close here. There are many insurmountable theological problems that are faced by trying to harmonize evolution and Christianity. These theistic evolutionists are trying to make the gospel, remember that quote I put up, they're trying to make the gospel more acceptable by looking more intellectually respectable. Okay? If that makes sense. They're trying to say, look we're respectable scientists, we believe in evolution. Now come talk to us about Jesus. But in the process, they've actually destroyed the entire foundation for the gospel. Because you don't need a redeemer if there's no original sin and no historical Adam. So there is just, I think, like I said, it's right-hearted. I think these people are probably Christians. I think that they're confused, very confused. But I think it's right-hearted, but it's wrong-headed. And so back to our original question. Our question was, are evolution and Christianity compatible? And I think that we can say with some confidence from logic, from science, and from theology that that answer is no.